Imagine the year is 2025. A catastrophic event has just taken place, and the Panama Canal has suddenly ceased to function. Supply chains are crippled, and the world economy is in arrest. How will world cope with the paralysis of this vital conduit? What alternative routes could transport our interconnected society through this blocked passage between the seas? In this video, we will look at the ramifications of losing one of the world's most strategic waterways: global economic disruption. In this grim scenario, the effects would be felt around the world almost immediately. Without the Panama Canal, maritime trade between Asia and Europe, or the east and west coasts of the Americas, would be severely hampered. The hardest hit sectors would likely be raw materials, oil, and food exports. Businesses dependent on just-in-time delivery of intermediate or finished goods would also suffer heavily. The economic shockwaves would spread globally. With trade flows disrupted, producers and consumers alike would bear significant costs. Experts warn this could potentially trigger widespread financial instability, plunging economies into recession. It would likely take years before new trade routes and shipping arrangements could stabilize international commerce. The global economic impacts would be severe and wide-ranging. Advanced manufacturing centers like China, South Korea, and India would see exports plummet. Western consumer markets would face shortages and price hikes, fueling inflation. Emerging markets dependent on commodity exports could face financial crises and currency collapses as trade revenues evaporate. Oil producers would be unable to efficiently supply key markets like North America and Europe. Food supplies would be severely disrupted, impacting nutrition and health in developing nations. Global industry would have to radically reshape complex cross-border supply chains that have been optimized over decades. The additional fuel costs for longer maritime routes could also have a compounding effect on shipping rates and commodity prices. Shockwaves to the tightly integrated global financial system could destabilize banks and stock markets. In essence, the sudden loss of the Panama Canal would unravel the core of our interdependent globalized economy. It would require years for world trade to rebuild equilibrium. How quickly countries could recover would depend on their resilience and ability to reorient economies to new commercial realities. Food shortages and food security. The Panama Canal closure's impact on food supplies and security could be catastrophic. Without the canal, critical shipping routes for grain, soybeans, rice, and other commodities would be severed. Food prices could skyrocket, causing severe shortages in net food, importing regions like Africa and the Middle East. Even major agricultural exporters like the US, Brazil, and Australia would see food insecurity rise as farm incomes plummet. With malnutrition already a concern in vulnerable regions, the food access crisis caused by the canal's closure could quickly become deadly. Preventing widespread famine would require emergency measures to keep essential food supplies flowing. Alternative transport routes would need rapid expansion. Food reserves and production incentives in less affected regions could potentially be used to aid heavily impacted nations. But inevitably, we would see a breakdown in the global food system as we know it today. The Panama Canal handles a significant portion of globally traded grain and oilseed volumes. Without it, the US would lose the fastest trade route from its farm belt to Asia. Brazil and Argentina's exports to China would also be severely obstructed. This could cause world food prices to double or even triple. Developing countries in Africa, the Middle East, and Southeast Asia would be the hardest hit by supply shortages and escalating costs. Even countries not fully dependent on imports would see domestic food inflation as agricultural sectors are disrupted. The world's poorest could quickly be priced out of basic nutrition. Wealthier nations would not be immune either. Despite being agricultural powerhouses, the US, Canada, and Australia could see domestic scarcities. Hoarding and protectionism could take hold if affluent countries choke off exports to safeguard domestic supply. This could exacerbate famine in the developing world. Without concerted global cooperation, starvation and malnutrition-related deaths could reach into the hundreds of millions over time. Even with emergency responses, the system shock to global food markets and security would be immense. Alternative transport routes. Facing this crisis, the world would urgently explore alternatives to move goods and raw materials. The most direct option is the Suez Canal, which also links the Atlantic and Indian Oceans. But with only one-third the capacity of the Panama Canal, it could only bear a fraction of the displaced traffic. Significant investments would be needed to expand its scale. Other potential transport solutions include the Northern Sea Route, Trans-Siberian Railway, and Northwest Passage through the Arctic. But these carry major drawbacks: lack of infrastructure, extreme weather risks, and massive investment costs. An ambitious transcontinental railway across South America could also be envisioned. However, constructing thousands of miles of new rail lines would take decades and astronomical sums of money. Ultimately, no combination of alternate routes could fully replace the Panama Canal. Its loss would force sweeping changes in global shipping patterns and economic geography. While the Suez offers the most straightforward fix as an existing passage, it would require billions in upgrades to accommodate much larger volumes. Its limited dimensions also constrain the size of vessels able to transit. But obtaining expansion approval could be complex given Egypt's instability. The Northern Sea Route through the Arctic is seen as the other, most viable alternate path. But harsh conditions, lack of ports and support infrastructure, and icebreaker requirements limit feasibility for safe large-scale commerce. Environmental impacts also need consideration. Upgrading the Trans-Siberian rail line could allow faster movement between Asian industrial centers and Europe. However, rail freight is far costlier than maritime transport. Cost to expand line capacity might also be prohibitive. In reality, all alternatives have major limitations. Combining multiple options could help, but would incur massive costs and delays. Keeping global trade flowing would require compromises and years of coordinated effort between nations. The world would have to accept harsh new commercial realities, geopolitical shifts. This catastrophic scenario would also have profound geopolitical consequences. With massive new volumes of trade diverted, alternate routes like the Suez and trans-Arctic passages would become centers of global competition and tension. Control over these choke points could tilt the balance of power between nations. Regions profiting from increased traffic would gain influence, while those bypassed could lose sway. Trade and economic alliances would shift, with ripple effects on wider foreign relations issues. Strategic territories like Egypt and Turkey along the Suez, and Arctic nations controlling northern routes could gain leverage. Maritime Southeast Asian and transcontinental rail transit hubs would also rise in prominence. But instability could follow if disputes arise between aspiring geopolitical players. On the flip side, nations like Panama reliant on canal revenues would suffer immense losses of income and stature. The U.S. may recalibrate its foreign policy and military posture if its regional influence wanes. In a canal-less world, the geopolitical map could be radically redrawn over time. Egypt could potentially emerge as the new nexus of Atlantic-Pacific trade given its control over the Suez Canal. This enhanced strategic importance could alter regional geopolitical dynamics. However, divisive national politics could hinder Egypt's ability to leverage this position. The U.S. role as security guarantor of the Panama Canal would end, reducing its dominance in Central America and the Caribbean basin. Rivals like China could try to fill this void. Alternatively, the U.S. might boost involvement in Egypt or Turkey if it seeks to retain sway over global shipping. Arctic nations like Russia and Canada would become major players by enabling northern passage routes. Territorial control and environmental stewardship would be key flashpoints, though. China also harbors ambitions of gaining influence as an Arctic power. South American economies could realign around Atlantic-Pacific railway networks spanning the continent and connecting commercial hubs like Buenos Aires, Sao Paulo, and Lima. But this would be an arduous undertaking crossing sensitive ecological and indigenous areas. Environmental impact. While dire for trade, closing the Panama Canal could have some positive environmental effects. With maritime traffic now bypassing Central America, habitats along the canal zone could be restored. Noise and chemical pollution from massive container ships would decline, benefiting ecosystems. However, increased Arctic shipping, as well as industrial activities supporting new alternate routes, could damage pristine polar environments through emissions, oil spills, and invasive species. Tropical deforestation might also rise if rail alternatives carve through rainforests. Mitigating these environmental risks would require regulation and sustainable development of infrastructure along new trade arteries. The overall climate impact of longer maritime routes also needs to be considered. Ultimately, replacing the Panama Canal could still have mixed ecological consequences globally. By removing a major shipping artery, the closure could significantly benefit endemic flora and fauna within Panama itself. Species relying on riparian and coastal ecosystems surrounding the canal would see less human impact. However, the loss of water flows through the canal could negatively affect lake and wetland habitats that are now interlinked. And if Panama's economy collapses, illegal poaching and resource extraction could rise. Increased Suez traffic could worsen invasive species transfer and pollution within the Mediterranean. Higher levels of ballast water discharge may impact local fisheries too. Expanding capacity would also increase dredging, with consequences for vulnerable marine biology. Arctic ecosystems are at even greater risk as maritime activity increases through northern passages. Noise pollution poses dangers for marine mammals like whales. More ship emissions also accelerate ice melt, while oil spills could harm fragile polar biomes. Global marine emissions may increase marginally as ships take longer routes, but this could be mitigated over time by energy efficiency gains. Overall, the direct environmental impacts are mixed, but the risks of habitat damage around choke points are a pressing concern. Infrastructure and investments. Reorienting global trade in this situation would demand mammoth infrastructure projects and investments. Expanding the scale of passages like the Suez Canal would require billions in complex engineering works. Arctic routes would need icebreaker fleets, search and rescue bases, and heavy-duty cargo hulls. Ports worldwide may also need enlarged terminals and deeper harbor channels to handle larger ship sizes. Across the board, national governments and private companies would need to invest heavily in transport systems for the new trade regime. Experts estimate that to meaningfully expand capacity, the Suez Canal would need an additional parallel channel, double tracking of certain passages, and deepening of waterways. This could cost $10 to $20 billion over a 5 to 10-year timeline, requiring major engineering feats. Creating functional Northern Sea route infrastructure would also run into tens of billions for icebreakers, navigation aids, seaports, and search and rescue systems. Canada and Russia would likely have to shoulder these costs. Private firms may also invest if routes appear commercially viable. Port expansions in key entrepôts worldwide would also be essential to avoid bottlenecks. Major European and American ports may need deeper drafts to handle larger vessels. Cargo terminals and intermodal links would have to be modernized to handle transshipments between ships and rail. Collectively, the world would have to mobilize immense financial resources and construction capacity, but it would help mitigate the economic shocks and give global trade a fighting chance at recovery after losing the Panama Canal. Emergency plans and preparedness. This hypothetical crisis underscores the need for emergency preparedness worldwide. While closing the canal may seem improbable, contingency plans by governments, corporations, and institutions should account for such high-impact disruptions to maritime trade. Critical response measures would include stockpiling essential goods like fuel and grains, securing priority shipping access, and capacitating agencies to coordinate relief efforts. Data analytics, tracking tools, and scenario models could help map probability and impact levels across industries. International organizations like the UN and WTO would need mechanisms to identify and assist hard-hit countries. Above all, a cooperative global approach would be vital. By thinking ahead and planning for even unlikely disasters, the world can build resilience against shocks to the interconnected systems we rely on. From food security to medical supplies, countries should assess vulnerabilities and stockpile critical goods that may face supply disruptions. Securing guaranteed freight capacity along constrained trade arteries should also be a priority to ensure national needs are met. Emergency response plans would have to incorporate both public and private sector stakeholders. Governments can direct resources and coordinate priorities, while companies can leverage supply chain data and flexibility. The shipping and freight industries would need to optimize routing, cargo loads, and vessel deployments. Port authorities must ready contingency operations to minimize disruption during the transition. Global organizations like the World Bank, IMF, and WTO could assist vulnerable countries through financing, aid, and adjusted trade policies. The world must think ahead to counter even low-probability but high-impact risks. Possible technological solutions. Innovative engineering could potentially mitigate this crisis. Futuristic concepts like floating underwater tunnels to guide ships across isthmuses have been imagined. Giant watertight tubes laid on the seafloor could guide ships across isthmuses. But feasible solutions like this require immense technological leaps. More realistically, emerging automated cargo system and smart shipping technology could optimize new trade routes and ports. Increased load factors through larger next-generation vessels could also help expand capacity. AI fleet coordination could minimize delays across congested arteries. However, promising as they are, such technologies would only complement major infrastructure projects using conventional methods. Until revolutionary concepts like submarine freight tunnels materialize, old-fashioned concrete, steel, and labor remain our best hope to rapidly facilitate trade should the unthinkable occur. The costs would be staggering, but human ingenuity can find ways to maintain connections and commerce. In the near term, technologies like automation, AI, and big data analytics can help make alternate trade routes more efficient. Autonomous vessels could optimize spacing and reduce congestion at busy choke points like the Suez. Machine learning can help model complex changes to supply chains. Further ahead, custom-designed megaships tailored for specific routes could increase load capacities. Nuclear-powered cargo vessels could also reduce transit times and boost route viability. Emerging hydrogen and ammonia fuel cell propulsion may help decarbonize the larger maritime trade footprint. More ambitiously, magnetic rail underwater tunnels could one day allow cargo pods to be efficiently shot through evacuated tubes. But even with technological advances, old-fashioned infrastructure expansion using steel, concrete, and muscle remain essential in this crisis scenario. Social and cultural shifts. Beyond economics, the Panama Canal's absence could have profound societal and cultural impacts. Regions reliant on canal traffic and toll revenues would suffer major demographic changes. Panama's economy in particular could collapse, causing unemployment and emigration. A key conduit for exchange between the Americas would also disappear. Shipborne trade in goods, ideas, and people would decline, isolating cultures over time. Millions who transit annually between the Atlantic and Pacific may instead have to fly or take lengthened surface journeys. Tourism dependent on canal cruise liners would evaporate. Global supply chains, markets, and partnerships nurtured over a century thanks to the canal would be severed. The sense of living in an interconnected world bound by rapid flows of commerce could diminish. For Panama and neighboring countries, the canal fostered prosperity and identity for over a century. Its loss could therefore have profound psychological impact on top of the economic trauma. People may feel detached from their recent history. The loss of the Panama Canal would certainly unleash enormous shockwaves, both regionally and globally. Entire industries and economies structured around this vital waterway would need to radically transform. What are your thoughts on this scenario and the impacts discussed? Would you foresee any other consequences not covered? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you want to see more of these types of videos, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.